for those who don't know. So let's Don, do you want to set up the presentation on looking at the intersection of diversity, equity, and justice and clean as a network and community?
Well, I'll say the first few words and hand it off to Deb.
However you want to do it.
It's more of a discussion than a presentation. We want to gather insights from y'all on both what you think it is that we're doing and where it is we want clean to go. And I'll also introduce my assistant, Velma. And I'm going to hand it off to Deb.
Great. So I'm Deb Morrison, University of Washington, but I'm here today on Wasanich traditional territory in Pender Island, British Columbia in Canada. So we put a document, and maybe Katie, if you want to just email that document out too, so that Bonnie can reach it, and maybe Jim, if you can't, grab it off the chat. And so we have a shared document that we're going to work off today. We're going to summarize into this document and have you work in Jamboards as smaller groups. And our thought is to sort of unpack a little bit about what diversity is first, because different communities of practice, scientists, social scientists, different communities broken up in different ways, have different understandings of what the word diversity means. And I think it's going to be important for us as a community of clean people to actually think about what our shared understanding of diversity is. And ask the question that sometimes is the harder question is like, why do you care? Do you care about diversity? And if you do care, why and for what and for whom are we caring about diversity? And it's important that we answer these questions for ourselves as an organization, as a community broadly, because how invested we are in any one moment to do the work of diversity, to do that justice work, is really about how we understand that work to be our work, as opposed to something that we just have to do in the world because we have to check a box. Okay. So we're really trying to get at that visceral commitment to this work by coming to a shared definition that we really understand and buy into in a whole way and see fundamentally as part of our effort. So we have a kind of grid that we want to work on, and we're going to seed in a couple initial ideas. And we want you to think about where you've seen these different sort of broad categories of diversity in your own work, in the world in which you're sort of moving into. So I'm going to share the screen to begin with, just so that we're on the same page, because I'm not clear who is and isn't. Can I share the screen? Oh, it does look like I can't. Okay. All right. So I'm going to share this. And is that big enough? Can people see it? Mm-hmm. All right. So what we are looking at here is these different types of diversity. So we're going to just briefly go over them, and then what we're going to do is we're going to put you into smaller breakout groups, and you're going to use this link here to the first Jamboard to pick, depending which group you're in, you're going to be in one of 5 groups, just as a forewarning here, Katie, 5 randomly assigned groups, and you're going to pick this slide. So it'll open up a Jamboard like this, and there are 5 slides for group 1 to group 5, and you're going to use little stickies if you haven't used Jamboard to kind of think about different forms of diversity, and you can stick the stickies all across the board as you sort of think about. So let's first think about these different forms of diversity. So the first idea of diversity is representational diversity. In a very broad way, and I'm only going to give broad definitions because I want you to actually think more specifically about it, what it means in your own context. Representational diversity is about having some kind of proportional representation to a category. So the most common one that we see in the sciences right now is things about racial diversity or gender diversity. And those are 2 aspects of identity that we can ascribe to people's bodies. We say, you are a woman, or you are a white woman, or you are a black man, or whatever. And we say there's so many people of that category in society, we want to make sure we have representation on some group about that. So that's an idea. That's one idea, not the only. That's one idea of representational diversity. Often when we're trying to get representational diversity, we do it through things like affirmative action. And the reason that we're trying to get representational diversity is because there has been some history of injustice based on those representations. So women and people of color have been marginalized. Black people specifically and Indigenous people have been marginalized in very specific ways historically. So we're trying to change that by making a new rule that says you have to have that kind of representational diversity. But really often what we're trying to get at underneath all that is varied perspectives on the world, different knowledge systems, different value systems, ways of knowing and doing and being in the world. And so these other three forms of diversity that we've named underneath are getting more specifically at that. So diversity of ways of being in the world and experiences in the world, that's called ontological diversity. Differences in knowledge and knowledge practices, so how we reason about the world, what knowledge we draw on, that's epistemological diversity. And diversity of values and beliefs, so that's axiological diversity. So my base assumptions that I'm working on when I start to be and do things in the world and build knowledge in the world. So questions on that before we break out into smaller groups. You are going to want to have that document open as we move into smaller groups. It's in the chat. So initial questions.
I don't have a question about what you just, overviewed, Deb, but 5 with 14 participants and 2.
Yeah, we're going to do less, I think.
That's not feeling right.
3, 4. How many are we? 14?
Yeah, I was thinking 3 or.
Yeah, let's go for 3, 5, 6. Let's go for 4. Let's go for 4 groups. Groups of 3 would be ideal. Yeah, let's go for 4 groups. All right. So your task when you get into your smaller groups is going to be able to share. I want you to take a few minutes just individually and use the stickies. We're just going to start with this first piece here of understanding forms of diversity. Don't go further down. And so you're going to be on that jam board, the understanding forms of diversity jam board. And then what we're going to do is you're going to use the stickies to answer those 2 questions. What does any of those forms of diversity mean to you? And where have you seen it in practice? All right. So, and practice can be any of the contexts in which you work or other things you've seen in the world. Okay. Because what we're looking for are examples to help us understand diversity more deeply. Okay. Often generalizations are a lot harder to understand than specifics. So we're going to try and work in the specific. Okay. Other questions about what we're going to do here? We're going to take about 10 minutes to do this initial thinking. And you can share out in a circle, make sure nobody's hogging all the talk time. Share out if you like, or just, feel free to organize your threesome or foursome as you like. You're all big people here. Okay.
Deb, one thing, just as I'm hearing from the international perspective on our ACE work, which had diversity as a very central priority, stood out when others in the world looked at our work. And it doesn't seem to be the way other countries are approaching ACE. And so there might be something, both our methodology, but also unique to our national circumstance that makes what you're both bringing to us here as uniquely important in this moment. And maybe just a word or two about why do you think that adding this focus in the Clean Network is important now?
Yeah, I will give a little bit about that, and then we'll talk more about that as we bring back people's understandings of diversity. I actually, so a couple weeks ago, Frank and myself and Tom Bowman were able to talk to Alessandro Caprini from Italy. He had written a brief about the Action for Climate Empowerment program to the Netherlands, I think it was, or Netherlands Envoy for Climate. And I read the brief and was like, okay, and I think what was missing for me, and I'm right, I actually sat down 2 weeks ago or a week and a half ago and wrote like a 20-page research paper conceptualizing this, because I was like, okay, what was missing for me was how we're understanding what justice is inside the ACE work and why it's fundamental to be woven into the ACE work. And so I'm starting to like just write a ton in this area to try and help clarify, like, what are we really talking about when we talk about justice and diversity and issues of equity inside this work. But to be able to do that, one of the things that we really need to understand is we actually need to come to shared visions of what these words mean to us and why they are meaningful to us, if they are meaningful to us. And so I'm going to just leave it at that right now, and we'll come back to this conversation afterwards. Okay, let's give 10 minutes on the clock. So we'll come back at 10:30. And Katie, can you pull us back? I guess you have the magic button to pull us back. All right.
Katie, you're muted.
Yes,
one
I will
thing-
pull y'all back in 10 minutes.
Yeah,
Which,
and
I'll let it go 10 minutes and then you get a minute to come back into the room, just so everybody's
okay. And just before you click the button, I'm just going to repost our shared workspace in the chat because I see a couple people popped in here. And the people in your small groups are responsible to get everyone up to speed. All right, 10 minutes, off we go.
And everyone is in, I recreated the breakout rooms, so I think everybody's in one. So you'll all be invited to join those now.
Thank you.
Hello, hello. We've been in breakout rooms. Now some of us are back. I'm surprised more of us aren't back.
Yeah, I wonder if some folks are just really in their conversations.
Yeah, we're not leaving until we're forced out. All
Sorry,
right.
Deb, I went like 1 minute over because I just
All
got
good.
into the discussion. So
All good. All right. As we start to debrief this, I want folks to understand a couple norms and thoughts about this. So the goal today is not to come to a singular understanding of diversity. And that's a norm that is often different from our work in science, where we like a definitive answer, where we're working toward a definitive answer. So I'm going to establish the norm of uncertainty and living with uncertainty and being okay with that. All right. So in that context, what we're going to really look at is I want you to take a couple minutes and I want you to scan some of the other boards. All right. So look outside your own group, read some of the stickies, and something, if something in particular resonates with you, I want you to drop it in the chat.
Yes.
Are you talking to me?
Take another 2 minutes or so and just pop in the chat things that are particularly percolating in your head as you're thinking about this.
and we got a little bit of background chatter somewhere. So I'm just going to mute everybody except for the 2 folks on the phone call, just so you're all aware for now. And then we'll, you can unmute yourselves except for the phone call folks. I'll leave them unmuted.
sorry about that. Okay, we'll continue and to sort of look across the boards and build into a shared document. I've taken some of the notes that folks put in the chat and paneled them into our shared working document, which again is at that link. And so thinking about the sort of big ideas that are coming across, if you have a look at our shared working document, is there anything that you feel like is really missing? And you'll note that we're, initially we're not doing this verbally. Part of that reason is actually to get multiple perspectives and voices into play, because we don't always have time for verbal space. But I want to give you an opportunity for the next 5 minutes or so to just like name things. So if somebody wants to like verbalize, feel free.
I'll throw it out there. Oh,
Go ahead, Patrick. Welcome to the call.
Thanks, Wendy. As I was looking across the boards, there's a lot of thinking about multiple ways of knowing and being, but I think part of all that is acknowledging and calling out privilege, and not a lot of that is pointed to direct in the boards right now.
Good point. I wanted to bring up something that may not be well represented by the sticky note we wrote, but we were running out of time. We had a discussion based on experience from my past where an assumed representational diversity by someone's external appearance was not how they felt about what their concern was that day. They were identified as Asian and someone tried to bond with them as Asian, and what was on their mind was being a vegan and feeling as a big outsider about being a vegan. And so I'm not sure we've captured that aspect of representational diversity, is that it's so much broader than even the ways we might be trying to represent. But maybe that fits better into one of your other categories. I'm not sure, Deb.
No, that's great. Actually, that brings up something. I'll just add it in here and I can add some language for that to folks. That's the difference between what's called ascribed and avowed identity. So, and we have identity that is put upon us by others, and identity that we own and name out into the world. And some of that is things that can be more quote unquote easily ascribed because we can see it in some way, or we see representations of it in the world in some way. So for example, I hand my passport to the agent as I cross into America, and they say, welcome home, because they want to see my American passport. I feel conflict with that because internally I identify as a Canadian. Okay. So that identity is a national origin identity, and it comes into conflict at different times as we sort of move around and understand ourselves. They let me into the border with no real further interrogation because they see me as a white English-speaking woman who's an American, as opposed to an omnisexual, like sketchy leftist, person who may be like problematic for them. So, those representations are how we move and are understood in the world. The fact that we categorize people is deep in our lizard brain biology. The fact that we ascribe power and differential implications to those is part of our social learning. And that's what we're trying to get at here. Okay, so that's the ascribed and avowed, and I'll add some definitions into what we produce out of this session.
But can't there also be, so you described ascribed in your own personal identity, but you could have multiple identities yourself.
Oh, yeah.
You could have that struggle of diversity even within yourself.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And so how do you think about addressing that, let alone addressing it with, a larger community?
Yeah, and that's the idea of intersectionality. And somebody else actually made a note of it somewhere further on here. So we have intersectional identities. I am a woman who's super girly, wears sparkly earrings, and a badass forester. And I don't see those as conflicting now, but when I was 20, I couldn't reconcile them, right? And so like how we understand our intersectional identities are very much about those social dynamics in the world and how we're positioned and how others are positioned on singular dimensions as well as these multiple things. And so it is an incredibly social, complex ecology that we're working in as we understand power dynamics in this space internally, because we internally process social narratives and we're fed them as little kids about who you can and can't be. And we're fed them as adults of like the structures that we hit as we try to do things. And so all of those things are negotiated internally and outwardly in our social systems. So yeah, that's intersectionality.
Something I might mention on from a dynamic perspective, or where things are headed or changing, is the importance of who are your educators, who are your teachers, in terms of who then listens to you and or feels welcomed by you. Or so what I'm getting at is it just is a reality in our society. Sometimes it's well-founded, and sometimes it's just something we have to deal with, that kids or families or people will gravitate more to educators who look like them, right? Mm-hmm. Now, it could also be they represent them or whatever, but where I'm getting at is just being aware of the relationship of the educator and the educated and the crossover, that you know, it's important in order to get a change, if you want to get a change, to realize that the educators themselves, you know, that it's just a factor that goes in there, right? Mm-hmm. That and there can also be kids like to listen to kids, right? You know, there's that kind of thing. I mean, a big factor of now we have a thing where society deal with trends within African American culture is being pretty generally more accepting of climate science, right? But being very, very skeptical about getting the vaccine. Right, my wife has many sisters. People that for her whole adult life, they're like sisters. They're always talking on the phone, whatever. An African American woman who's in L.A. and she's saying she goes down and there's 200 people getting their vaccine, and she's the only black person there dealing with that people have it. And what people say is something of, they mentioned Tuskegee. Right, so
right.
It's like scientifically we've had problems with this. Anyway, I mean, there's just all these kind of factors that is you know, where are we and where we want to go. It's understanding the different dynamics. Thank you for letting me talk for a bit.
No, and Jim, you bring up a really good point, which is that other issue is these social conversations about diversity, of how we're negotiating power, how we're understanding our diversities. They're embedded in histories. Right? They're embedded in real histories that people have had. And I've heard that rhetoric lately about vaccines and how like a very thin understanding of it. And what you just gave is a really great, deep, rich understanding of the idea that when we think something is so obvious from a scientific perspective, the social reality of making it happen is different because there's really big history about medical apartheid and experimentation on different groups of peoples over time. And it is totally unrealistic to think that given those histories, people are going to respond the same way to new innovations in medicine or whatever that might be, you know, Frank.
But if you take that one step further, you know, as a science teacher, and I was one for a long time, the social phenomena of how science moves given those histories, we tend not to touch.
Yeah.
We tend to stay, somebody else over another class of other or at home is going to handle that. And so that's that interaction between science and society. I mean, I taught science, technology, and society for years, but it's an optional class. It's not a core class, but it does illustrate that this exact issue of how diversity, injustice, and historical precedents merges as we try and use science to make decisions in community. So it is totally germane to our work together. But that's why I deeply appreciate what you're doing here to help us get much more significantly focused in this way.
There's a really great book that was produced by the Zen Education Project that I remember reading like a decade ago. And it's something about like lowly mechanics, maids and midwives and something else, and it's a people's history of science, and it goes back to it takes a social science perspective on science, thinking about like who has been included in defining what the current understanding of mainstream science is, and who hasn't been, and how have innovations that are in existing mainstream science actually fundamentally involved many marginalized groups that never got credit over the years. And so, like, what are those histories that we're not taught in school that we should be taught if we're truly understanding the value that diverse perspectives and experiences of people bring to bear on the enterprise of science? And so it fights this idea of objectivity and neutrality in science. Objectivity as a principle is something we aspire to, knowing we will never reach because we are humans engaged in a cultural endeavor, which is science, right? We seek it because we seek to be reproducible, but we understand that the questions we ask, the ways in which we engage our methodology, all of those things are cultural in nature, and they have diverse perspectives behind them. So I just want to pause for 1 second before we keep talking. So we're going to only do the first half of this today, and we're going to be okay with it. We didn't even get through, like, the other half, because this conversation is about the idea that multiple voices and perspectives are important. And the way that we start to unpack and think about this is one framework of diversity, okay, that breaks out diversity. And as many of the comments that I'm seeing are showing, this is not the only way, right? It doesn't show that overlapping and interweaving complexity of what diversity is in our real lives and our histories, okay? So, but it's just sort of like a way in to the conversation. So other thoughts? We have another 5 minutes or so for general conversation. Then Dawn, jump in at any point. Tiffany, I see you have a number of things in the comments. Do you want to name something specifically?
No, I was listening to what Frank was saying, and I think that, having teenagers myself and working with a bunch of teens, that they're very, they find their voices online that offer these social science perspectives on things that are happening. And I feel like they're not kind of back to what Patrick was saying, they're not having people taking the lead in the classroom and helping them unpack the unspoken.
Mm-hmm. I also want to lift up something that Jim said earlier that I thought was really interesting. So there's this dilemma of, Derek Bell named it as the role model dilemma. So we want to have representational diversity in our educational workforce because we want youth to see themselves, right? Like, we want female science teachers, we want science teachers of color, because we want kids to see themselves in it. But even more important than that, in some ways, is we want relationships and professional learning and educators in ways that they see science as a diverse enterprise, so that when I, as a white female teacher, am standing in front of a young Black man who's from a totally different positionality, I can still open the world for him, right? It's not about me being the same as him. It's about me showing him that people like him are in the work, right? And so that's actually really the critical part, is that I personally have more of the different types of diversity in my brain that I can offer and open into the world of youth that we're working with. And I would say that's true for any educator working with any age group. All right, other thoughts? Laura? I wasn't looking at him, sorry. Unmute yourself.
I think I'm the only Laura on the call. I'm not sure if you talked about valuing knowledge from outside credential. People that don't have credentials, still valuing the knowledge and what ways of thinking they bring to the table. And also, maybe it went through the chat, socioeconomic. That reminded me when you talked about maids and restaurant workers. It goes along with the credential idea. Maybe the people can't show their experience on paper, but they still have the experience and need to be seen as a valuable contribution.
Mm-hmm. it's interesting because I grew up in blue collar rural Canada. And many of my, family and friends are like, wow, you got dumber going to school, because the way that I communicate with them and talk about things sometimes is so far removed sometimes from how they talk about things and processing. But they're like, you're like too removed from what's real in the world. And I think we're experiencing that sometimes in different community boundary crossing, like you're saying, like when we're trying to work with rural communities, when we're trying to work with cultural communities that are just not similar to us. And so anybody who's credentialed actually is a little bit like challenged now to actually learn how to actually relate back to the real world. So I actually feel like credentialed people have more of a challenge than non-credentialed people. But,
Yeah, I live in a rural area as well, and I find that to be a bit of a difficulty because you're not seen as one of the people.
Yeah. So it's a challenge to all of us to constantly write, not just for research, but to write for specific communities that we may want to be working with and to reach. So yeah, Frank?
Well, there's I read about 120 resumes on an internship program we have at NOAA over the past couple of days, and you read the stories of why they're trying to move into the sciences and get a series of supports, and some of them are really compelling stories of where a young woman who's first generation, one parent is from Mexico, one parent is from Colombia, no one in their family has an advanced degree. Work is preferenced over, and yet she's brilliant. And her teachers are trying to encourage her to take further and more academic work, and she wants to become a scientist, which is, so there's a family dynamic here. And I don't know if we've named, it's in culture, but it's also inside family, where it's an intergenerational dynamic. It doesn't matter who your parents are. At some level, I mean, we always want to advance people to the best of their abilities. But if you don't believe that you have it, or people are telling you you don't have it, or that's not a priority, there's something there that I was hit over the head over and over again in these stories by these students. There's hopefully there's something there, but the family dynamic is a piece that I was very centered in over the last couple of days.
And you actually name one important thing there, Frank, that I think, we'll take away and bring back in our next conversation too, is that the idea of how we look for diversity is not going to be found in resumes. Resumes are historic accumulated privilege, back to Patrick's point, and finding a way to hear the stories of what people value in their own backgrounds and experiences is going to be a better way forward to find diversity. Jim?
Yeah, thanks. And so going along with both what you're saying, yep. The value, the importance of having parts of our education system ways that can help break down the problems and do things. NOAA's intern program would be an example of so much to get to be a scientist. You need connections, you need money, you need somebody to get you into Yale or whatever. But there can be these programs that give opportunities where it doesn't require that to get you the foot in the door. And there are people who deliberately are saying, no, I mean, what is Carl Sagan, Neil deGrasse Tyson? He was like an intern for Carl Sagan. It was a very deliberate thing on Carl Sagan's step. You were going to get you into Columbia, right? You know, I mean, those kind of things make a real difference. Of having programs, and that, I guess there's just a quick one, is our area of climate change. I guess there's no really time for this. It really benefits from dealing with the diversity issue. I am finding, and what we're dealing with in our cities, the tie between climate science and action and systemic racism is so incredibly bound up, and we advance by addressing them both together, and it really is a big thing. But
I'm totally with you. I know you and I are on the same page. Yeah. So we're gonna pause here.
I'd just like to add one quick comment there, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but since I'm on the phone, you can't see me. So because I want to add to that yes, I couldn't agree more, Jim. Those two are integrally entwined, and we saw that even more through the pandemic. The pandemic brought that into magnification. So I think that was a really good point to bring forward.
Especially with education, like we really saw that inside education amplified in
yes, and even with dispersal of information. You know, we all went online to try and find out, you know, CDC recommend whatever it was. But if you don't have internet, which many rural and especially Native communities don't, they didn't have that option. You know, so it really was, and was seen in the education realm as well also. But yeah, just so many different pieces unfolded through the pandemic that magnified those two issues and how intertwined they are.
So I'm going to pause us, and because I think we could potentially talk forever.